European Commission is promoting structural changes to the way external financing is distributed and also changes to providing humanitarian assistance. That is the topic for an interview with Michael Köhler, Acting Director General at DG ECHO, who has come to Bratislava at the occasion of Umbrella Development Forum. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here.
This interview is part of Umbrella Development Forum, a policy advocacy event, one of the major civil society and donor gatherings in Europe in the area of development cooperation and humanitarian aid. 150 participants from more than 20 countries, excellent speakers and high-level guests, great panels, workshops, and everything you need to know about the future of humanitarian aid and development assistance. So, once again, welcome, Mr. Köhler.
Thank you.
I would like to know, what do you expect from Umbrella Development Forum?
Of course, we are living special times with respect to humanitarian aid in particular because of the Ukraine crisis. In the last 20 years, we didn't have a humanitarian crisis of that dimension in Europe. The last similar experience was probably the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which led to massive displacement. So it's very topical to discuss now. But it's also important that in a country like Slovakia, NGOs come together, experts come together to discuss humanitarian aid, not only in Ukraine, but in the entire world. It is important that the humanitarian thinking and a discussion on how we can help better in the world is not only the specialty of some in Brussels or in Geneva, but that we go to the countries, that we engage with civil society, and therefore I was very happy that Umbrella is organizing this forum and I wanted to be part of it.
And you're willing and prepared to listen to those people who are engaged and who work in civil society, is that right?
Absolutely. A forum is a platform for dialogue. Of course, I'm going to speak, but I'm going to listen even more. I want to hear, I want to give advice, I want to get advice, and I want to lay the foundation for a dialogue after that, because this is a platform to get together, to make acquaintance, but after that we can do follow-up, we can meet in Brussels, we can meet somewhere in the field, and that is what I'm looking forward to.
EU has allocated overall more than 243 million of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Can you be more specific about this aid, what it contains and how it is distributed?
Of course, the European Union helps in the Ukrainian crisis in many, many ways. The amount that you mentioned, 243 million, is just humanitarian aid that we mobilized since the beginning of the year up to today. I'm sure at the end of the year we are going to have much more. And of course, in addition to humanitarian aid, there are other forms of aid. There is multi-annual financial assistance, there is development aid, there is in-kind assistance. For example, my department, DG ECHO, has also mobilized the Union Civil Protection Mechanism that coordinates in-kind gifts of member states. That alone, at this moment in time, already represents more than 300 million euros. Now, on the humanitarian aid, we are working in Ukraine and in Moldova with about 25 projects at this moment in time. They cover the full array of needs that people have that are now deprived of their homes, who had to leave their places, who are forcibly displaced, and that's already 10% of the population or even more. So it's about food, it's about shelter. Shelter has become the major preoccupation of the Ukrainian government, so how to house people who had to leave, for example, the eastern oblasts. It is about education for children, because of course about 25% of the people on the run are children or even more. It is about cash. People have no more money. It's a lot of health support, but also psychosocial support for people who are traumatized because of the war. So it's the full array of needs, including protection, including legal advice, for example. But of course, the main focus at this moment in time is on shelter, is on food, is on cash.
Can you be more specific on how do you cooperate with civil sector, with NGOs on the field?
Right. You know, in general, this is not specific to Ukraine, but in general we work with 3 or 4 kinds of partners. On the one hand, the United Nations organizations like UNICEF, like UNHCR. Secondly, the Red Cross, ICRC and also IFRC. Thirdly, civil society organizations, mostly international civil society organizations. Think of Oxfam, think of CARE, think of the Norwegian Refugee Council or others, or Welthungerhilfe, for example. And then we also work with member states agencies, those member states that have a development agency. Now, traditionally, we spend about 43–45% of our money with NGOs, be it in Africa, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, or Venezuela. In the crisis in Ukraine, at this moment in time, and I looked at the figures this morning again, it's a little bit less than 30% that go to the NGOs. Why is that so? Because obviously NGOs first have to build up capacity. Ukraine, if you do not look at the crisis in the eastern separatist areas in Lugansk and Donetsk before the war broke out on 24 February, Ukraine was not a country where you had a lot of humanitarian aid. So most of the NGOs were not very present. But now they are building up capacity, and therefore I think we have an increasing possibility to work with civil society. And when I think of civil society, I think of three categories of organizations. Certainly the big international NGOs. Secondly, NGOs from neighboring countries, and here I would like to pay tribute in particular to organizations in Poland and also in the Czech Republic, for example. And thirdly, of course, Ukrainian NGOs. At this moment in time, we don't work directly with Ukrainian NGOs because we have some legal problems, but indirectly. That means that the NGOs that we are contracting, they are then subcontracting NGOs in Ukraine. Or, for example, when we deliver aid, the distribution of the aid in the country is then done by Ukrainian NGOs. So we have indirect links, but not direct financing links.
Speaking about Ukraine and millions of euros that are pouring into the country that is absolutely in need, some people question whether this process will or will not mean pulling away resources for humanitarian aid from other parts of the world that are also in need. Will something like this happen?
Well, I think the honest answer is yes and no. At this moment in time, it is no, because obviously all the assistance that we mobilize for Ukraine comes on top of the assistance that we give, for example, to Mozambique, for example, to Colombia, for example, to Sri Lanka and other countries. We have a system whereby we start the year with a normal allocation that is then distributed to the individual crises. And then in the course of the year, we can mobilize additional money from our financial reserves as soon as new crisis situations come up. So what we call the baseline allocation, the amount that we had at the beginning of the year, stays the same. We did not take any money away from any other crisis in the world only to finance the humanitarian aid offered in Ukraine. But of course, the longer the Ukrainian crisis takes, and unfortunately it looks a bit like we are going to have a crisis for many years, the longer it takes, the more we have to mobilize money from our reserves that we cannot mobilize then for other purposes. Now, what are these other purposes? There can be the many other crises that we have in the world. My organization, DG ECHO, is right now working in about 100 countries in the world, so Ukraine does not stand out alone. And secondly, of course, there are the indirect effects of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, like let's say, rising food insecurity that you will see in many, many countries around the world, and that would, in a way, invite us to do more in these countries. Now, my personal hope is that the Ukrainian crisis is so big and politically so important that our political leaders will mobilize extra money for Ukraine, but also extra money that will help us to address the food insecurity in the entire world, because this is a crisis that nobody had foreseen in its dimension. And if we want to live up to our values as European Union, but also our interests, we need to make a specific financial effort.
Where will you get this extra money from? Can you be more specific on that?
There are many possibilities. Last week, the European Commission proposed a new scheme for the reconstruction of Ukraine, Reconstruct Ukraine, which would be a specific fund whose financing is not yet totally clear. It could come from new specific contributions of EU member states. It could come also from, for example, let's say a new debt approach. So the European Union would be authorized by member states to go to the financial markets and levy debt, as we did for the Next Generation EU program. It could be through some reshuffling in the budget from other policy areas to humanitarian aid. So there are many possibilities. There is money. It's a question of mobilizing the political will.
The political will, that's what I wanted to ask you, if you can see any hurdles ahead, especially from this political point of view.
At this moment in time, it is absolutely breathtaking how much goodwill there is, both in political circles, but also in the general population and in the private sector to help Ukraine. So if I need money for Ukraine at this moment in time, I don't have a problem. It is more difficult to mobilize money for the other problems in the world that are exacerbated, that are made worse by the Ukrainian crisis, like the food security situation.
Yeah, like the food crisis, just like you said, which countries are top priorities from this perspective, from the perspective of global food crisis?
Well, it looks a little, or it depends a little bit how you look at it. There are countries that are very much exposed to the crisis in Ukraine because traditionally they import a lot of their wheat, their cereals from Ukraine, like for example Lebanon. Also Egypt is very much exposed because it usually imports lots of cereals from Russia and from Ukraine. So these countries of course have a problem, which is a supply problem. They don't have that much hard cash, they don't have so many, let's say, budgetary reserves, but they don't have a traditional hunger problem. So there it is a question of, let's say, liquidity, of hard cash. It's a problem that, for example, the International Monetary Fund can solve. But there are other countries where you already have a very strong food security problem. For example, Yemen. Yemen is probably the world's largest food security crisis. People are really dying from hunger. I've seen babies in Sana'a that were about to die from hunger. So in those situations, Afghanistan, Yemen, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, where you have a mixture of causes, conflict, effects of climate change with drought, for example, or even floods, the contrary, and now on top also the increase of prices on the world food markets, on the world fertilizer markets, on the world energy markets. That leads, of course, to a worsening of an already very, very bad situation. And the United Nations tell us that this year, and this was before the Ukraine crisis broke out, the situation of hunger is already about 30% worse than the year before. So we already have more food insecurity and hunger in the world in the big crisis situations. And this is made much, much worse now by the Ukraine crisis. And there's no end in sight. Therefore, it is so important not only to help these countries, but it's also so important to bring as much harvest, as much cereals out of Ukraine to the world market. And for that, again, the European Commission has taken an initiative some days ago in order to bring the cereals that otherwise would be shipped through the Black Sea now through railroad connections to the world markets.
Can you talk about a little bit more about the structural changes in providing humanitarian aid and in the way that external financing is distributed that I talked about at the beginning of the interview?
Absolutely. Humanitarian aid still follows the same business model that it followed 30 or 40 years ago. 30, 40 years ago, of course, first the number of people who needed humanitarian aid, which this year, before Ukraine, the United Nations estimated at 274 million people in the world that really depend on humanitarian aid, which is 300% more than 10 years ago. You see the steep rise. So, but the business model, how we commit, how we implement humanitarian aid is still the same as many years ago, when the classic scenario for humanitarian aid was that you would have a natural disaster, a tsunami, an earthquake, a flood, a big fire or so. So the humanitarian intervention would be short, maybe half a year, maybe a year maximum. And after that, either the problem is solved or development aid takes over. And that means that the entire system is a system whereby, for example, you don't work a lot with national authorities. You don't work a lot with national civil society. You have a problem. The problem is such that the national authorities are overwhelmed by the problem, for example, after a big flood. And then you bring in the international aid system. It tries to address the situation, help the people in need, and then it moves out.
So what the change will be?
And the change today, I think, is that we are in a different situation. We are in a situation where in 80–90% we are in long, protracted man-made crisis. We are in Afghanistan for 20 years. We are in Syria now for 12 years. We are in Palestine for 30 years or more. So we need to look into prevention. We need into building up local capacities. We have to implement a much more localized aid. We need to go further than just food and shelter, Because food and shelter and health is what an IDP or a refugee needs in the first 6 or maybe 12 months. But what do they need afterwards? I will never forget a discussion that I had in Yemen 2 months ago when I went into a camp speaking to women who were displaced. And I asked them, what can we do better to help you? And I was expecting that they would tell me they need to have better health services or better childcare for the children. But they told me, no, what we need are jobs for our husbands, so that the husbands can earn money to supply the family with food, for example. Now, job creation programs are traditionally not the focus of humanitarian aid. This is more development aid. Mm-hmm. So we need to look into long-term structures. We need to look into the needs that people have that stay for 15 years, 20 years as refugees or IDPs. We need to go local, empower local organizations. We need to make available finance for long periods, not only for a year or half a year. And we need to bring much more money to the sector. We need to go beyond what the taxpayer is offering right now. We need to think of innovative financial instruments. And we need to think of a new partnership with the private sector in particular, because the needs are simply outpacing our possibilities.
Definitely. Can you tell me a little bit more about the important processes and policies that DG ECHO is working on currently that you maybe want to highlight?
Right. We came up with a new policy paper last year, which is a communication of the European Commission published in March 2021, where we set out the agenda, where we set out what we want to do in the next 3 or 4 years on the basis of the commitments that we took in 2016 in Istanbul at the Grand Bargain, at the World Humanitarian Summit. And this goes in the direction that I just mentioned. First, how to become better and more efficient and more effective through localization, through mobilizing more finance, through more flexible and multi-annual funding, through a new partnership with the civil society, for example. Secondly, we want to become greener. There is the European Green Deal.
Absolutely.
We need to become more ecological, and that means 2 things for humanitarian aid. First, the way how humanitarian aid is implemented needs to become more sustainable. So rather than supplying energy to a refugee camp through diesel generators, go for solar cells, for example. This is something we're doing at large scale. But then also we need to help with the means of humanitarian aid to prepare for climate change. So prevention, disaster prevention, which we are doing at a large scale in Asia, for example, in Pakistan or other countries, to help people to prepare for floods and empower people to deal with the problems themselves. That is something which has become ever more important.
It's a complex process.
Mm-hmm.
There are only a handful of FPA NGO holders from the CEE region. Are there any plans that EU will make these funds more accessible also for local and national NGOs?
Well, the funds are accessible. It's a matchmaking issue. There is a problem. Humanitarian aid in the European Union is, if we are honest, very much a northwestern European Union affair. You have the Scandinavian countries, you have Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands. And already in Southern Europe, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, you have a relatively low level of participation. First in funding, but also when it comes to the implementation.
Why is it so?
It has to do with traditions. It has to do with a certain way of looking at world politics. It has to do with the fact that, for example, the Scandinavian countries have been very active in the United Nations system since the very beginning of the system. It has to do with the fact that traditionally the countries that were part of the Soviet bloc, of course, didn't have the financial means and had also other policy priorities. But now things are changing, in my view, and they have to change. And in that respect, the Ukraine crisis, I think, will teach us a lesson. Today we see that for a country like Slovakia that shares a border with Ukraine, the same thing goes for Romania, the same thing goes, of course, for Poland and for the Czech Republic. For these countries, it is an expression of their values to help their neighbors, but also of their interests. Because if you want to help people, then humanitarian aid is one of the means of choice. But also if you are interested in the stability of your neighboring country, or if you are interested, for example, in somehow regulating migration. In all these scenarios, humanitarian aid is a good instrument. So I think we should learn the lessons from the Ukrainian crisis. We all need to involve ourselves in humanitarian aid. It is a tool of our international relations, although it is not something that should be manipulated for short-term foreign policy goals. And it is a responsibility of all of us. So I came to Bratislava also because I think it is great that here civil society organizes such a forum. Civil society should bring this message to the citizens, to the people who vote in elections.
When you talk about messages, do you have any message specifically for the representatives of Slovak ODA and also to the Umbrella Development Forum audience and civil society?
The message is our doors are wide open. It is a pity that we have so few NGOs from Central and Eastern Europe that so far have gone through the so-called certification process to become long-term ECHO partners. We have more than 150 NGOs that have gone through this process, that are partners. I would like to see a situation where we do not only have the choice between an Italian, a French and maybe a Swedish NGO, but also a choice between a Czech, a Slovak, a Polish and a Romanian NGO. Not only in Romania and Ukraine, but also, for example, in Libya, also in Syria, also in Afghanistan and also in Mali. There are many ways to do that. There are many ways to get to this process. We are ready to help. So if NGOs in Slovakia need advice, if they want to have some sort of counseling from our part, if they want to be put into contact with NGOs in Western Europe so that they can form a consortium, so that they implement a project together and learn, we are very ready to help and to bring people together, because for us it's a win. It's a win if we have more Slovak and other Central European NGOs.
Hopefully Umbrella Development Forum will help in this process. Michael Köhler, thank you very much for your interview.
Many thanks indeed, and I hope we all have a very fruitful forum here.
Thank you.